taking time to join us in our continuing study of the book of Proverbs. And tonight we're in the 29th chapter of the book of Proverbs, and we want to start with a passage beginning in verse 2, which reads, "When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn." We have seen principles like this suggested before. We're not intending tonight to make a political statement, but the truth is that this 3,000-year-old book of wisdom does speak about issues that relates to everyday life, and that includes government and the role of government and God's judgment over government. And the effect that those who rule have over those who are ruled. So the Proverbs talk about the character of people, whatever kind of government we're talking about, whether it be a monarchy, as was true when the Proverbs were written, in the place and time they were written, or whether it be more of our representative government, or something in between. The fact is that the people in charge are accountable to God for the way that they rule, and the decisions they make are going to have a dramatic effect on the lives of those that look to them for leadership. Some of the other translations of our passage read, "When the righteous are increased, the people rejoice, but when a wicked man bears rule, the people sigh." Another, "When the upright have power, the people are glad, but when an evil man is ruler, grief comes on the people." The old contemporary English version reads, "When justice rules a nation, everyone is glad, and when injustice rules, everyone groans." Well, I guess not everyone. There might be some people making a profit off of that evil, but for the average person, life is going to get a lot tougher and a lot less pleasant. As I mentioned a moment ago, recently, looking back on recent material in Proverbs, we've seen similar points made. In the 28th chapter in verse 12, "When the righteous are victorious, there's great glory. When the wicked arise, men hide themselves." Again in verse 28, "When wicked people rise, people hide. When they die, righteous people increase." I don't think that the Holy Spirit was unmindful of the fact, when he guided this collection together, that these principles were repeated. I think that says something about emphasis. It says something about the need that those in charge and those who are ruled need to be aware of the importance of the job of those, and the importance of character in those who rule over them. I like what Mr. Aitken noted here. He said that we're contrasting here the consequences for society when either wicked or righteous men hold the reins of power and influence. When the wicked are in power and control the affairs of state, violence and injustice are actively encouraged and flourish unchecked. The people groan under an intolerable burden of oppression. And so they do. What happens in the street and what happens in the seat of authority are directly connected. When good men give the tone to society and conduct all affairs according to their own high standard, people rejoice. There is a greater happiness. Prosperity abounds. Voices ring cheerful. I have lived my whole life in the United States, where there has been relative stability. I'd say greater than relative stability. We have enjoyed a peace and a freedom that maybe has not been known anywhere else in the world in our time or any time. We have truly been blessed in so many ways. We can look around and see some cracks in that foundation and some questions that are raised. On the other side of that, when good people are in charge, it's certainly a comfort to those who simply are honest and want to live their life from day to day. But as Matthew Henry notes, if the wicked get power in their hands, wickedness will abound. And religion and religious people will be persecuted, and so the ends of government will be perverted. This was written by a fellow named John Phillips, who wrote a couple of volumes set on the book of Proverbs. Now, he wrote this back in the mid-90s. That was several years ago. But it sounds very familiar. He said, in this country, sodomy is condoned as an alternate lifestyle. I might say it's more than that now. It's condoned as a virtue. And the questioning of it is criminal behavior. We've come quite a ways in the wrong direction. Women can have abortions on demand. Again, I might add, I think we've gone beyond that in many places. There are some differences in abortion laws, and I recognize that, but in some places you have, as a matter of legal right, if there's an attempt to abort a child and the thing is botched and they're born alive, you can just kill them after they're born. And there are people, human beings walking around who feel good about themselves and who think that's a great thing. And they stand up before microphones, before crowds, and they tell people that they're here to protect these kinds of abortion rights. It's a health care issue. Killing unborn children is a health care issue. Anyway, it's a dreadful, horrible stain on our land. It's been around for a while. It wasn't a new thing, abortion itself being legal, of course, in the 1990s. It had been around for a while since then. Before then, I should say. But anyway, he goes on. Slaughter on the highways by drunken drivers is treated with astonishing leniency. The criminal's rights are often given more consideration than those of the victim. A guilty man can fight his conviction in court after court, often evade punishment altogether, or obtain early release from prison. He's not just talking about sins in a land. He's talking about sins that are incorporated in the system of government. They are sanctioned by law and by procedure. Divorce is epidemic, he writes. Addiction to drugs is increasing. Men of proven decadence are being elected to high offices, and many of society's ills can be traced back to Supreme Court decisions that were made by the wicked, as Solomon would not hesitate to call them. And as I recall in his work, he gives several examples, we'll not go into that right now, of Supreme Court decisions, one after another, that really legislate and really take the Constitution and place into law things that degrade and that lower us as human beings and that insult God. Unelected judges that have great power, as well as elected officials in the legislature and in the executive branch. People that he calls are men of proven decadence, and I might add women as well. And so, a government that gets off the rails and that begins to steer in an anti-God direction, an anti-moral direction, they claim to be liberating and standing for freedom, when really what they're standing for is moral rot. It's going to affect every layer of society. It's going to cause problems in every direction. It's a 3,000-year-old message, and I'm sorry to say that we still see those kinds of negative effects in our land today. Well, verse 3, whoso loveth wisdom rejoiceth his father. He that keepeth company with harlots spends his substance. And here are two different sons and two different impacts that these sons have on their fathers. Again, some of the modern speech translations read, a man who is a lover of wisdom is a joy to his father. He that goes in company of loose women is a waster of wealth. Another reads, if you love wisdom, your parents will be glad, but chasing after bad women will cost you everything. Or another reads, if you appreciate wisdom, your parents will be proud of you, It is a foolish waste to spend money on prostitutes. That's a pretty blunt way to say it. But there is, on the one hand, a son that is governed by wisdom, and another, a son that is just governed by lust and license. He is a great waster of whatever he's been given, and in a shameful way. And so here are two different families, and two different futures for those families. I think there are three lessons maybe that we might mention from this passage. In the first place, don't you find it interesting how he describes here this first young man? He talks about him being not just a wise young man, not just having been exposed to wisdom, not just learning wisdom, but he that loves wisdom. I tell you, if we can raise our children to love wisdom, we will have done a good service. He is wise not only who has arrived at the complete habit of wisdom, but who does love it, desires it, is hungry to listen to it. What a great compliment to pay to someone. In the second place, I think it reminds us again, it's another one of the Proverbs that reminds us about the power that children have over their parents. We think about the parents having the power over their children, and that's right. But back even in the 10th chapter of Proverbs, and in verse 1, in the very first statement made in this section, the great section of our book we call the Proverbs of Solomon, we find these words: "A wise son makes a glad father. A foolish son is the heaviness of his mother." When our children are young, they're in our control. They better be in our control. That's when we got to get control. And to guide them, love them, encourage them, rebuke them, teach them, show them, all these things. But the longer years go on, it seems the more those roles tend to reverse in this sense, that as our children are outside of our control, they still have our heart. And the effects of children, older children, on their parents, the decisions that I might make as an older child might have a painful effect on my parents as well. Solomon knew something about that. I'm thinking back to what he wrote in the book of Ecclesiastes. In the 2nd chapter of Ecclesiastes, and in verse 18, Solomon wrote that he hated all his labor which he had labored under the sun, because I should leave it unto the man that should be after me. And who knows whether he should be a wise man or a fool? That's quite a confession to make. Solomon, I think, is describing a time in his life when he lived apart from God, when he was so wrapped up in material things. But nevertheless, he had to admit that as it occurred to him that all the things that had become his life, he got wrapped up in materialism. He said, all these things that had become my God for a time in my life, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to keep. I was going to die and leave them to somebody else. And he adds this, he said, I wasn't sure if the guy who was going to get them was going to be wise or a fool with them. I don't know that there was any particular question about the succession. I think Solomon knew who it was, that is Rehoboam, that would take over after him. I'm just not sure he had that much confidence in him. And as it turned out, he had reason to have some questions. Rehoboam was not a terribly wise man. Anyway, the point is that what our children do can certainly have an effect on us for a long time. But, of course, another lesson that we learn from our proverb is that the influence of bad company. Evil companions corrupt good morals. Evil companions certainly can help us along the road to ruin. I think about that passage in Proverbs 6 that we looked at some time ago, where he describes here the folly of adultery, and he talks about don't be allured by the adulteress, this wily, crafty adulteress, skilled in manipulating you. As he says here, by means of a whorish woman, a man is brought to a piece of bread, and the adulteress will hunt for the precious life. He describes a man who is reduced just to the crust of bread by a woman that will take him for everything that he's got. The so-called good time friends, the worldly, the drunkards and the fornicators, the people who involve themselves in what is sometimes miscalled adult entertainment. It's really just ungodly behavior. Those folks are mighty glad to spend your money up, and they're mighty glad to use you, to take you for a ride and then dump you out. I think we all remember the story in Luke 15, the famous account of the prodigal son. When he came to himself and returned home, he didn't return home. Apparently didn't have shoes on his feet. I mean, he left with his inheritance, as it were, in his pocket, and with all kinds of arrogance and all kinds of assurance in himself that he had a better way of living than his father's way, and he didn't need those old moral laws, and he was going to just live for the moment and so on. And he comes back empty, with one important exception. He has now something he didn't have before, a penitent heart. He also has a lot of scars, but he has a penitent heart, and he begins to try to rebuild his life. But of course his older brother wasn't that glad to see him. Wasn't glad to see him at all, really. He was disgusted by him. The father received him in, but the older brother, you remember, said, how can you fawn over this fella? This thy son, he's come who has devoured thy living with harlots. Well, he wasn't far from wrong. He had taken his portion of the inheritance, this prodigal son had. And verse 13 tells us that he had wasted his substance with riotous living, or as one translation says, wild living. Point is, there's nothing new about that. But it's always been foolish behavior. Now, the devil will make sure, if I have a rebellious heart, that there'll be somebody there to encourage me to rebel and to reinforce me in that decision. But it's a decision that hurts ourselves and hurts others as well. We can be a grief to our parents, and we will be if they care about righteousness. And the wise man says here, that's folly. It's self-destructive, and it's hurtful to the people that really do care about you. These good time friends didn't care about this young prodigal. They took him as a fool, and they used him that way. And the ones that cared about him, his father really was the one who cared about him, received him back. But how much better if he had learned the lesson without having to make the mistake. That's what the wise man wants you and I to do. Let me go back to the Proverbs now, chapter 29 and verse 4. And this again has something to say about government. The king by judgment establisheth the land, but he that receiveth gifts overthrows it. If we look at the words that are used here in our text here, the king by judgment establishes. That's what the old King James says. That word judgment properly means a verdict, favorable or unfavorable, a judicial pronouncement. So he says here, the king by judgment establisheth the land. The idea seems to be that someone who uses his official powers to pronounce verdicts that would be in connection with and consistent with the law of God, with the standard of morality, a man guided by principle, a man of that nature, who's in authority and who uses that authority properly. The king by judgment establisheth the land. He causes it to stand. He brings security to the land. On the other side of the ledger is the man that receives gifts. The idea there is oftentimes seen in the idea of receiving bribes. It could be some other things. But it all comes back to the idea of somehow misusing funds in a selfish way. And he winds up contributing to the overthrow of a land. If you have people in charge of a land, this was true 3,000 years ago, it's true yesterday, true today. If you have people in charge who really care about right, then a land is going to be blessed. Whatever they run is going to be blessed. But if you have people who are only concerned with ingratiating and enriching themselves, then you're going to have disaster. People are going to get hurt, and the whole thing's going to fall apart. An honest ruler makes a nation strong. A ruler that takes bribes will bring it to ruin. A nation will be strong when it has a fair and just king, but a nation will be weak when it has a king who is selfish and demands gifts. When the king is concerned with justice, the nation will be strong. When he is only concerned with money, he will ruin his country. So what are the lessons that you learn here? In the Cambridge Bible, this comment was made, the contrast in the two members of the proverb between the impartial administration of justice and the venality and corruption, which are the curse of Oriental courts. There's the contrast between the two. The man of principle versus the selfish and greedy man. Sad to say, that's not just a problem for ancient Oriental courts. Greedy for bribes. I guess today we talk about influence peddling. It's the same kind of thing. There are judges that take bribes in order to render a certain way. I don't know. I'll just tell you, I've not done the minute investigation. You read things, and they may or may not be true. But we have read over the past few years about people who sit in positions of power. Maybe they are in charge of the foreign policy of our country. At the same time, they have a charity that they've set up from which they take a large salary. And foreign nations decide they want to contribute to this charity that will wind up, a significant amount of that, in the pocket of these people who are going to be directly involved in making decisions about whether these nations will be able to get a particular contract or some sort of support from the government. That's almost like you're selling your influence, isn't it? If that's true, that's just sort of high-handed corruption. Nothing new about that. Here's another fellow, man in high office. And maybe he's got a son, and that son is doing business with a foreign country, and this powerful man may go over and say, if my son's business doesn't get a certain contract, maybe you don't get the treaty you're looking for, or you don't get. And so, lo and behold, things happen. That's just high-handed abuse and corruption. I don't know. It doesn't make any difference to me who does it. It doesn't make any difference to me where it's found. If it's found in America, if it's found among this group or that group, or if it's 10 years from now or 10 years ago, or 3,000 years ago. If you have people running the government, and more of them, if they're not punished, will do so, who are using their place to gain for themselves rather than being concerned about the people that they're supposed to be watching over, and in some cases electing them, then it's just going to be a sad and story in a downward cycle. Mr. Wybray doesn't see so much the idea of bribes as he does maybe unjust taxation. He makes the point that some of this idea of this money flow may not be from strict bribery, but rather because some king decides they want to get involved in some outrageous foreign war, or they've got some pet project, and so they just increase the taxes to the point where people are gouged by them, so that they might be able to take that money either to exercise their pride in one way or the other, military glory, or some sort of palace for themselves, or whatever it might be. When a government does not see itself as serving the people, but somehow the people are there to serve them, then you've got a very sad situation. You've got an abuse of power. And I think it was Mr. Garrett who made the point. He said, there's that connection between our passage here in verse 4 and verse 3. In verse 3, you saw a son who abused the gifts he had received from his father to spend it on his lust, and here you see an official on a national level abusing their place in order to ingratiate themselves or fulfill whatever lust it might be. Yeah, it's a similar story, isn't it? One would affect a lot more people than the other. Both were written about 3,000 years ago, and both are intensely modern, practical problems. Wisdom will steer us away from that. But if we're not wise, if we're short-sighted, then we'll cheat folks. But here's the thing, and this is a good lesson for Wes and for everybody else, from the highest to the lowest in the land. There are people who think that somehow, if I get the chance, if I have the opportunity, then I will cheat and I will lie and I will steal and I'll just scrub all the computers and I'll burn all the evidence and shoot all the witnesses, and I've gotten away with it. There's a God in heaven who knows every bit of it and who will not allow us to escape from what we've begged for, the judgment that we have asked for. That's a good thing for all of us to remember, whoever we are. Let me go back to the 29th chapter in verse 5 this time. And here's another principle of wisdom. The man that flattereth his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. The man that flatters his neighbor. The man who says smooth things to his neighbor, stretching out a net for his steps. A person who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for him to step into. We've seen warnings about flattery in the Proverbs. I remember an old preacher one time making the point, and it stuck with me, and I've thought about through the years how true it is. He said, it's amazing the power of flattery. It's amazing what people will do to be praised or in response to praise. He said you can flatter a fella into doing things that you couldn't threaten them to do with a gun. They wouldn't sell out as quickly under the threat of a weapon as they will because they have that weakness for flattery, and you can just manipulate them, and people do. That's what the flatterer does. He is buttering somebody up to use them. He's not trying to encourage somebody. There's a place for encouragement. But here's a fella who is manipulating other people with his words. Or a woman in some case might. Back in the 2nd chapter of Proverbs, the adulteress again is pictured as using her smooth talk to manipulate some untutored and unwise individual. Wisdom will save you from that woman, that somebody else's wife, who tempts you with such sweet words. And so flattery, is a danger. Matthew Henry, he explained flattery as in part being those who profess that esteem and that affection for others they really don't have. They don't really care about them, but they need to make them think they do in order to accomplish whatever they want to accomplish. It always comes back to something selfish. Pulpit commentary adds about a flatterer. He says it's someone who says only what's agreeable, applauds his words and his actions indiscriminately, and makes him think too well of himself. He's no true friend. Another writes, by misleading him as to his real character, the flatterer brings him to evil, prepared by himself or by others. False words may only encourage foolishness and prevent someone from truly becoming wise. So, learn to discern the difference between praise and flattery. And don't allow our pride and our ego to believe everything good that's said about us. Mr. Clark reminds us, beware of a flatterer. He does not flatter merely to please you. He's got something else in mind, and that's exactly right. And so the warning in our passage, the man that flatters his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. Most of the translations, and I suppose most of the commentators that write about this, and maybe you and I as well, we read this passage, and when we talk about his feet, To whom does the pronoun refer there at the latter part of that verse in verse 5? The man that flattereth his neighbor spreads a net for his feet. Well, we think of that being spreads a net for the one who is being flattered. In other words, the flatterer is laying a net out there to catch you. And I believe that's probably true. But there is at least the possibility that he's saying here that the man who flatters another lays a net that the flatterer will be caught up in. At least one of the modern speech paraphrases reads that way. The Good News Bible reads, if you flatter your friends, you'll trap yourself. And I think that at least that's possibly true. I think that is many times the consequence. We ultimately are going to be trapped ourselves by that sinful behavior. God is going to call us into account for it, and men may call us into account for it. I think in the next verse we find very definitely the idea of sin being its own punishment, of sin bringing about harmful effects. Maybe harm was intended on somebody else, but it comes back to us. In verse 6, in the transgression of an evil man there is a snare, but the righteous does sing and rejoice. In the transgression of an evil man there is a snare. I think a snare to himself, clearly in this case. He's talking about that trouble that sin brings upon the sinner. In the in the steps of an evil man there is a net for him, but the upright man gets away quickly and is glad. Your sins will catch you, but everyone who lives right will sing and celebrate. To an evil person, sin is bait in a trap, but a righteous person runs away from it and is glad. So sin tends to catch the sinful. Sin brings its own punishment. It reminds us of one of the Psalms, the 9th Psalm I'm turning to. And in verse 15, in this Psalm of David, he writes, the heathen are sunk down in the pit they have made. In the net which they hid is their own foot taken. The Lord is known by the judgment which he executeth. The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands. You know, sin comes back to harm the sinner. The craft punishes the crafty. Barnes sees here the offense of the wicked rising out of that confirmed habit of evil becomes a snare for his own destruction. There is this habit of sin that might be alluring to some, but always winds up hurting the one who laid the trap. Here is the peril of the sinful way. There is not only a punishment at the end of it, but a snare in it, Henry writes. One sin is a temptation to another, and there are troubles which, as a snare, come suddenly upon evil men in the midst of their transgressions. Nay, their transgression itself often involves vexations. Their sin is their punishment. I do believe that's true. Punishment can at many times be sin can many times be its own punishment. I like this quote by Phillips. He writes, the evil man does not tell his imitators of the diseases he has contracted, or the guilt that gnaws away in his innermost soul. Let me pause there for a moment. I'm sure it probably strikes you as it does me. Most folks watching this certainly would have this attitude. A great sadness and frustration when you see people in the world who just live ungodly lives. They're high-handed about it. And you have all these groupies who just think it's so wonderful how they can, just waste themselves and waste all the resources and blessings they've been given in pure selfishness and dangerous behavior and all kinds of things. And people say, oh, isn't that great? Well, Phillips is talking about that kind of situation. He says, the fellow who is so glad to have everybody following after him doesn't really tell you about the suffering that his lifestyle brings on him. He doesn't talk about the torment of addiction. He doesn't reveal the haunting fear that someone he's wronged will seek revenge. I might pause again. I've known more than one famous person, and some not so famous, who thought that being a serial adulterer was made them somehow sly, and they were ahead of the game, and they were really enjoying life and living life until that jealous husband showed up and took their life. That's an old story. The Proverbs talks about that story back in the 6th chapter. The evil man doesn't speak of how he cringes at the sight of the police, or how he awakens at the night terror-stricken by thoughts of the certain judgment of God. I think, if I might pause again, we might be surprised at people who seem to live without a thought of God when they're up against it, or when they might feel their very life to be threatened. Suddenly, all those thoughts come flooding back to them, and it's not a very pleasant thing. There's a great difference, the point is, between, on the one hand, someone who has a peace of conscience that comes from being right with God, and another fella who's got to keep himself half drunk all the time just to keep the bad dreams from coming back. He said, this evil man does not talk about, all of these fears. Instead, he drinks and carouses and laughs and sneers and mocks and blasphemes and cheats and lies. The evil man seems to be carefree and successful and popular and clever. He's caught in a snare, and his life is a sham. I think Mr. Phillips was exactly right. Only the righteous can enjoy a sense of security. I believe in one sense that's true. I think a man can, as I said, can keep himself distracted by all sorts of things that he might be able to buy, or things he might ingest, drugs, various drugs he might use that sort of keep him from feeling his feelings and being involved in really any kind of serious soul searching. But it's far different working 24 hours a day to keep yourself distracted, as opposed to somebody who can look in the mirror and be satisfied with who he sees. And he can recognize himself as a servant of God, flawed but forgiven, and working every day to be more like Christ. Those men could not be more different, and the world fawns after the wrong one. The good man has a conscience at peace, free from the snare of sin, and is therefore glad. He knows that God forgives him on his repentance, and this makes him happy, or generally that he rejoices in the happy life which his virtue procures for him here and hereafter. We're saved by grace, but we're called to serve. And a man who has the conscience to know that he is both forgiven and serving God finds life, whether he has a lot of money or not, whether he's famous or not, he finds life a whole lot more pleasant. So here's a proverb that reminds us that transgression is a snare. It's a painful and unpleasant way to live. Let me mention one more. The 7th verse, the righteous considereth the cause of the poor, but the wicked regards not to know it. Let's look again at our words here, and then we'll start an understanding of what exactly he means. He talks here about the cause of the poor. The poor here, we've seen this word several times before, as we mentioned here. It's a word which literally means to dangle, and it suggests the idea of someone who's in a precarious position. And I think particularly in terms of physical poverty. Here's somebody who's in a hard way. And here is a man who considers such a person. They take knowledge of them. They give attention to them, as some other translations say. That's one man. He doesn't shield his eyes from that fella. And when he sees him, it moves him. It has an effect on him. It brings forth a mercy from him. It brings forth a compassion from him. Now that's a very different guy than the other guy. The poor are still there, but his reaction is very different. He regards not to know. Know what? The cause of the poor. Let me mention that. That word cause, again, is used of judgment, and oftentimes it involves the idea of some legal action. A righteous man knows the rights of the poor, the ESV says. or a righteous person knows the just cause of the poor. The righteous care about justice for the poor. The righteous are concerned about the claims of the helpless. And there's some people that just doesn't register with them. As this, our English translation here, a little bit awkward, he regards not to know it. Other translations say the wicked don't understand what they need to know about that. Another reads, the evildoer gives no thought to it. Or finally, good people want to do what's right for the poor. The wicked don't care. It just doesn't affect them. It doesn't move them. And that's, I think, what one point that Solomon's teaching me here is that, you know, if God influences us as He should, it's going to affect the way we see other people. We don't just see people that can help us. We see people that need help. And if we don't have that view of God, or if we're not influenced by somebody who does, then we just have a very different way of thinking about things. I like what one fellow wrote. He said, the righteous know and recognize the righteous claims of people of low estate. What's due them as men, and in particular cases. But the godless has no knowledge from which to recognize such things. I mean, he just doesn't understand. Why would you make all the fuss about that guy on the bottom of the heap? He can't help anybody. What would that do for me if I did that? It is the character of a wicked man that because it is a poor man's cause, from which there's nothing to be got by, he regards not to know it. In the true state of it, he cares not which way it goes, right or wrong, because it's just not his problem. And what good would it do me? If you go back to the book of Job, we've been studying recently in our class at the building, the book of Job. And one of the great things that could be said about Job was that in better days he was a man who cared about the rights of those who were his inferiors. And yet they were not inferior to Job because he saw them as being human beings. 29 and verse 12. I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had none to help. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. He says in verse 15, he was the eyes to the blind and the feet of the lame, a father to the poor. He defended the wicked from those who would gobble them up. He talks about not despising even the cause of his maidservant and menservant. If they had a complaint against him, he gave them a fair hearing. He was that kind of man. He was influenced by God, and had been apparently from his youth. Pulpit describes the other kind of guy, the wicked man, who pays no attention to the problems of the needy, so that to become fully acquainted with its details and its bearings. He has no knowledge which would lead him to enter into the poor man's case, to sympathize with him in his distress. He's the kind of man, Mr. Dean said, who can daily look at Lazarus at his gate and find no call for pity and charity. He can see a wounded traveler in the road and pass by on the other side. You know, he's just, you know, that sense of mercy has not been inflated by the Spirit of God. It's not been brought to life in that way. I think it's, let me, as I close tonight, mention a fellow's name from history that you may not be familiar with. I don't know how many of us have ever read much about a fellow named William Wilberforce. I don't know all about his doctrines or his beliefs or his whatever, but I do know enough about him to know that he was a man who rose to a position of prominence, who became in the 1800s in Britain, he became a member of Parliament. As a young man, he was not a moral man and lived a dissolute life by his own admission. And then he came to be very serious about religion and became influenced by the New Testament, the teaching of Christ. And along with others that he met of that same spirit, There was a fire that caught in him. And he thought, I need to use this position that I have to try to help people. And so he tried to work through law to help people who were on the low end of the scale. And there was nobody lower in Britain at that time, and in the British Empire, which stretched over the world, than the African slave. And when he became acutely aware, because of the testimony of friends of his, about how these slaves were captured, how they were treated, how they were sold, how they were moved from one place to another, sold by Africans to Europeans in West Africa, and then shipped in these incredibly cruel slave ships to the West Indies to work in incredibly cruel circumstances. He said, this is a scandal and we can't have this. And so he worked for 50 years. And it was not just through him, but through his influence, that there was a law passed in about 1807 or so, which outlawed the slave trade. And that was a great accomplishment. But that didn't free the slaves that were already enslaved. And so he continued to work and year after year to bring up before these legislators, to appeal to their conscience, that it's just awful to think that we are still allowing these folks to be mistreated like this. And it was in 1833, I believe it was, that Wilberforce, among others, saw the passage of a bill in the Parliament that outlawed slavery in the empire. And the enslaved people were finally freed. And I think it was just a few days later that Wilberforce died. That sort of had accomplished his life's work there. Now, the reason I bring all that up is to make this point, that sometimes I have heard the Bible blamed for slavery. The truth of the matter is, those who are influenced by the gospel of Christ are those who recognize every man as a brother. Paul would write about a slave, and he couldn't overturn the whole of the Roman Empire system, but he could appeal to people to say, it doesn't matter if that fellow's in slavery or whether he's the master in this situation, every man who's in Christ is a brother, and every human being has worth and has a soul. The point is that when you think about the great influences to free people from bad circumstances and to reach to people, it's all been by folks who've been influenced by the Word of God. And that's what this passage, I think, would remind us of. That the righteous considereth the cause of the poor. It's the fellow that doesn't know God, to whom all that seems strange and foreign, and really not his problem. So, anyway, I appreciate very much your listening. We'll pick up there next time. I hope that you can join us, Lord willing, next Tuesday night. Till then, wish you the best, and we'll talk to you soon.